And record. Okay. So, welcome to session 3 of Scorch. So, today we're going to quickly do a quick refresher of some of the stuff that we've covered. And then we're going to go and start talking about Bootstrap, one of the CSS frameworks that I talked about last time. And then we're going to talk a little bit about JavaScript. So, as usual, slides are available on the websites. And then if you need the exercise files, they'll be at the link down there on the GitHub. So, first off, we'll start with a couple questions just as a refresher. So the first question, let's see if I get this to present. Give this a 1, 2, 2, 2, 2. So I believe this should start it on here. So I go ahead and start a question with what is a component? All right, hello, it is the ghost of Kieran's future. I accidentally cut out this section of the recording because I've got to hit start again after I paused it for the first question. So we'll just go through and do these slides really quickly. So quick question 2 is, what are the 3 languages that are used in web pages? And I'll let you guys pause it if you're interested. And so the answer to this one is going to be B, which is HTML that provides the structure, CSS, which provides the change to the appearance, and JavaScript, which runs the code and dynamic changes. Now, for the second question, I'll let you pause if you're interested in answering it. And so for this one, I didn't like how it was worded. Technically speaking, A was the correct answer that I was looking for. But C and D can technically be true in some ways, so it's a little bit of a toss-up. So I apologize for that, but A was the original answer that I was going to look for. So getting into this, as we've seen previously, CSS takes a huge amount of time to do, especially if you want to make it look really good. And so that's why we're going to use CSS frameworks. So for today, we're going to be using Bootstrap is going to be the CSS framework that we're going to use. And basically the main idea is that it helps us to build things out quicker. So Bootstrap is the option that we're using. There are other options like Bulma, Tailwind, some other ones, but the thing to keep in mind is that not all of them are free, and not all of them will allow you to use them on every type of site that you're going to use. So just be very careful when you're picking CSS frameworks to make sure that they're good to go. Bootstrap is free and open source, and so we can use it for whatever we need. And so the important thing is that we're using Bootstrap 5. Please be careful when you're looking at documentation. Make sure you're looking at documentation for Bootstrap 5. Same thing with any questions that you find on Stack Overflow or on Reddit. You want to make sure that you have the right one. So this is kind of what the site looks like. And if we go into here, we can even look at whatever the latest releases are right there. So if we go ahead and click on this, there's a newer version of Bootstrap apparently. So if we go into the docs here, ooh, it looks even fancier. So generally speaking, we're going to be using either 5.2 or 5.3. There shouldn't be that many changes or differences, but between 4 and 5, there's quite a few. So just be careful. And so we're going to be using a new type of way of loading our files called a CDN. And so the way that this works is, as you can see here, there is a CSS file, and the CSS file is available on the internet. So this is what the CSS file looks like. I know, it doesn't look very nice. So what we're going to do, instead of loading it via like downloading the file and then using it locally, we're going to actually just tell our system to directly grab it from there. And so I'll explain how to do that in a little bit. We did make a post about some other options for CSS, so if you are interested, you can go ahead and check that out. There's a thing, it's just how to cheat at CSS, and there's a ton of information about different CSS frameworks, and it compares them, and there's also stuff like CSS generators and a bunch of other things to make it life a little bit easier. There's lots of other reasons to use CSS frameworks. One of the main ones just being that it takes care of a lot of things you haven't even thought about, like screen readers, and also things like people in different countries who read in a different direction. So this is a right to left website versus a left to right website. You can see they're backwards, and that's a thing that you probably have never even thought about in your life, or what it's like to read a website if you're blind. So this is one of the things that is super handy about using a CSS framework, is that it sort of handles these things for you. And the next thing that is super important when you're dealing with Bootstrap, and generally speaking with CSS frameworks, is to remember that you should not be memorizing things. It's very important. Memorizing stuff isn't very handy. You should know when to use the different components and do all that stuff, but trying to memorize different snippets and the code that's behind certain snippets is completely useless. There's 2 options for trying to make this easier. One of them is something like this system that we have linked here in the slides, which is Bootstrap 5 quick snippets. So if you go ahead and install this, and then I were to, let's say, for example, let me just quickly pop open some stuff here. Let me just quickly grab a file that I will open with VS Code. So here's kind of what a file might look like. If I go ahead and let's say I wanted to start a new file and I want to have Bootstrap set up with it, what I can do here is I can just say bs5 dash, oh, I forgot to turn off safe mode. So let me just hit trust. There we go. And now I can do bs5, and then we have this option here. We go ahead and click that. It'll now load everything in for us. And so like I was saying before, we can see here we have a link at the top here that's linking in Bootstrap CSS version 5.2.1, and you can see here it's linking it in to this tag for us, and it's doing a bunch of other fancy security stuff for us. Super handy. It's also added in the JavaScript that some of the stuff for Bootstrap needs. So it's loaded all of that for us. We don't have to deal with any of that. We just have to go in and put in whatever we want. Okay. So let's get started. So as we're going through today, we're going to be going through and building a website. So an actual website instead of just kind of building some sort of messing around stuff. So this should be kind of a nice change of pace as we're going through. And keep in mind that the stuff that we're going to be teaching today is universal. So Bootstrap, we're teaching the Bootstrap specific version of this. But as we saw last time, a lot of the components that we're going to be talking about, like accordions and all that sort of stuff, is pretty universal across the board for design systems. So they might call them something different. You know, an accordion might be called a collapse in a different system. A card might be called like an info or something like that in a different system. Whatever it might be. But generally speaking, a lot of these principles are the same as long as you can recognize what they're useful for and how they're used. It's the most important thing. So we're going to start with a familiar face. So like I said before, Scorch is written with the Bootstrap framework, so super easy for you to get some examples of how it works. And so the first problem that we run into, if we're going top to bottom from a web page, is just helping people get around. How are people going to actually be able to like find stuff on our pages? So if I come back to the Scorch site for a second, we can see here at the top we have a nav bar. This nav bar includes things like links to different pages that we need and all that sort of stuff. And the big thing with this as well is that as we make it smaller and get towards sort of the resolutions that would normally be found on phones, as we get smaller, we see here, oh look, there's a little thing that popped up down here. If I click on that, we get a drop-down menu. And this is a much easier way of doing things on mobile than it is for to try and have something like this where it's all spread out across the board. Because if you imagine on mobile, something that is like this, where it's all crunched up together, you might find that these individual things are smaller than the size of your thumb, for example. So you want to be very careful on mobile, and Bootstrap helps to handle that all for us. So nav bars, you can get the information about them from the documentation. This is going to be a good thing that you want to keep doing whenever you want to try and find stuff. So there's two different places you want to look. There's the regular documentation, and then there's the examples. So in the regular documentation, we can come down to nav bar, and we can see here's the code, and we can see what it looks like, and then we can go ahead and we can copy this code if we want to use it. So if we want to go ahead, we can copy that, and we can put it directly in here. So we can see where it says place our nav bar. We can place that right there, and we're good to go. So if we went ahead and open this in a new tab, and then saved it. Oh, well, in this case, actually, I'm reusing a file. There we go. That's what it would look like. Now, if we wanted to do the same thing, but we didn't want to have to go to the documentation, there's also the option if I type in bs5-nav, I think it's navbar-default, which is right here. If I go ahead and click that, it'll now insert kind of the same sort of thing. And then if I go in here and refresh, we get something that's pretty similar. You can also come into the examples page, and there'll be a lot of examples that are more sort of ready to go for you, and they've been kind of styled for you in a nicer way, so that they're a little bit nicer even than what regular Bootstrap offers. So if I go ahead and click on headers, for example, we can see here a whole bunch of these different nav bars that are really fancy. And if we go ahead and we right-click and inspect them, we can see here, we can hover over this, and we can see, okay, there's a header there, and then there's a container there. So if I go ahead and I copy the element, I can now come in here, and if I collapse this down and delete it, I can go ahead and I can chuck something like that in there. Actually, let me get rid of where this says header here and do it like that. And then now if I come back to our page that we were looking at from earlier, we can see here we have the exact same sort of thing that I just copied from the examples. So these have some more built-out things, like there's more fancy things. So if you want to have things like sidebars that aren't included natively and stuff like that, there's a lot more fancy stuff that's included in the examples if you're interested. Okay, there's other navigations you can use, like tabs, if you have a whole bunch of content that you want to show up. You can also use accordions. You can use a bunch of other things to kind of get that sort of content if you want to. Buttons is the next thing that's super handy for helping users get around. And there's two different types of buttons. So one is the CSS class, which can be placed on an HTML element of a button or an anchor link. This is useful for a whole bunch of different things. And there's the actual HTML element. So the HTML element, as we'll see later, is mostly used for firing JavaScript, and non-navigation items. So submitting forms, searching, that sort of stuff is all typically done with an HTML element. And that's called the button element. It's just spelled out like button, just normally sort of stuff. An anchor tag, however, is useful for any navigation sort of things. So if you're sending somebody to another page, you'll want to use an anchor tag, and then you'll want to add in the class btn, which is button, for on Bootstrap. So if I go here and I come to buttons, we can see here button, there we go, like that. where we have class, and then we can say button. And then if we want to change the color, we can say button primary in this case, and it'll use the primary colors that are available there. Okay, so with nav bars also tend to use buttons. The only thing that matters here, and this is the only thing that matters, is if you are going to have multiple navigation bars on a page. If you don't, you can ignore this section, like this slide right here. But the reason this matters is because you have to tell it where you want it to show, like what you want to show up when you click that little button. So if we go back to what this site looks like, for example, when we go down to the mobile view, whenever we click this little thing, what it's actually doing in JavaScript is it's telling it to show a different nav bar. So when we click it, it's now showing a different nav bar. And to get that to work, we have to tell it which one to follow. So in this case, this data BS target is using a CSS selector to determine which thing it needs to show up. And then we can use an ID like this. So here we have an ID for navbar nav. And then here we have hash, which is the CSS selector for ID. And then we're saying navbar nav. So we're basically telling it, hey, this data BS target, we're going to target this ID right here. And whenever somebody clicks the button, we're going to make it show this thing right here. And then that shows everything that shows up there. So this only matters if you have multiple navigations. If you don't, you never really need to change this. But if you do have multiple navigations, you have to change navbar nav to like navbar nav 1 or navbar nav 2, something like that, so that it's different and it's unique, because IDs have to be unique. Otherwise, every time somebody clicks this button, everything that has navbar nav as the ID will be opened. So just keep that in mind. How do we make a good first impression? So basically, once we kind of start off with our navigation, we want to kind of keep people actually wanting to see our page. The whole point of building out a page is to have people who actually want to be able to see it. And so what does that actually look like? So we can use something called a hero. And so if I go ahead and click on this, for example, this is kind of what heroes look like. So they're typically put at the top of the page, just underneath where a navigation is, for you to be able to see stuff like this. One good example of this that is done also in Bootstrap is if you go on any of the ucalgary.ca sites, they're also done in Bootstrap as well. And you can see here, this is what their heroes look like, where they have a big image right after the heading to make it clear, like kind of a message right at the beginning to catch people's attention. And so, yeah, that's kind of what the purpose is. They're called hero blocks. They're basically like a big thing that says, hey, we're worth checking out, sort of thing. Just something that looks interesting and sort of catches people's eyes. For us, it's that diagonal banner at the very top of the page for the Schulgenite site. Okay, so here's where we're going to start with the exercises. So basically, you're going to be able to pick a topic for your site, or you can use some of the suggestions that we've made if you want, essentially. So if you don't want to create your own content, we do have 3 options for different designs that you can use, and the content for those 3 designs is available for you to use, however you want to use them. If you do want to create your own one, that's great. Just keep in mind, it's going to be a little bit harder for you to keep up just because you're going to also be creating content. I would recommend using something like ChatGPT to generate your content instead of trying to do it by hand, because it's going to take you a while. But you can do that if you want to. So essentially what you're going to want to do is come into your file, just open up kind of a file anywhere on VS Code, and then just do your BS5 and then your $ here to be able to create your first page. And then once you've done that, we essentially want you to create a nav bar and a hero for the top of your pages. And so the examples that we kind of have some different alternate options. So essentially for this first design here, you would be doing from this part here down to where it says pair. So this first top little section here at the very top, before all of these different things at the bottom, is what you'd be doing if you want to use design 1, which is going to be available under exercises. And then design 1, you'll see you have all the content. You have kind of the example picture, you have the logo, and you have some extra stuff inside here. So you don't have to worry about this stuff, actually. So if you want to use that, you can. Alternatively, you can use design 2, which is for a game. It's a pixel-based Metroidvania game. And that is going to be available in design 2, which will have all the content in there for you to use. And basically, you're going to want to create just this top right here. You can see there's the header and then there's the image if you want to do that. Option 3 is a design for a chameleon, sort of like a reptile place where you can buy reptiles, essentially. And if you want to use this, then that'll be option 3. Generally speaking, we've laid them out so that 1, 2, and 3, it gets progressively harder in the examples, but you don't have to do that yourself. If you just like the design of one, just do that. You don't have to do exactly what we did here. So go through, you can either pick one of those 3 designs or do your own, and then just add in a hero and add in a nav bar. So just go back into the documentation and go ahead. You can also go to on the Bootstrap site. If you click on examples, you can go on here and it'll show you heroes, and it'll show you like headers and stuff like that. And what you can do here is if I open up the heroes and the headers, you can also just go in here. And for example, if you want to see how this works, you can right click and click it, and then you can go ahead and like grab this code if you wanted to, for example. So we'll give you guys a bit of time to try all of that out. So if you have any questions, you can ask your mentors as well as you go. Okay. So, all right. So now we kind of we have a page, we have our nav bar at the top, and we have a hero underneath that. So now that we got them hooked, now what do we actually do to keep you watching to see our site? Well, it's time to actually write some content. But it's kind of, here's the question. If you saw something like this, would you actually want to read it? I guess besides the crime being boring, there's kind of a question of like, why would you actually bother to get through? It's kind of just like, just kind of there. So maybe you would have been willing to get through the last one because it's only 3 sentences worth of boring. But what about when it's a couple paragraphs worth of boring? How about this instead, right? And so when we're taking a look at doing design stuff, a lot of the times what you have to realize is that you're not actually trying to get less information. A lot of the times it's about breaking up the information and changing the way that it looks. So when we're looking at this, the one on the right hand side here, I'm pretty sure if I remember correctly, I think there's 25% more text on the right hand side than there is on the left. But you wouldn't even bat an eye about reading a site that's on the right hand side versus on the left hand side, this looks awful to read, right? And part of this is just because of the way that it's been broken up. It's got nothing to do with the amounts of actual text that's there. It's just about how it's been broken up and how the human eye sort of parses the information. So what can we use to kind of like make this information easier to digest? So we got some data on the left here. And then on the right, all that I've done is just put it in 3 different columns. But generally speaking, it feels a little bit less daunting on the right-hand side. And the only reason why is because it feels like 3 separate things as opposed to one large concept all at once. So most things, you won't be able to just take the first sentence and break it out like this and do whatever. But usually what you'll end up doing is making sort of a short heading, and then you'll have some content underneath it. And breaking your text up into multiple sort of chunks of whatever you're trying to get across can make it much easier, right? A bullet point list is much easier to understand than 12 paragraphs on a topic, right? So the question is, how do we actually split up our content? So the main thing that we start using is what's called a grid in Bootstrap. And so there's kind of 2 divs with 2 different classes. So there's this div that has a class of container and a div with a class of row. And essentially the way that this works is your main container typically will just be kind of on the outside of everything. So if I'm looking at this, I kind of have, I would get rid of this main part here probably. And then you can just have something like div with a container like that. And then you have div with a row like that, right? And you can have multiple rows and whatever you want to do in there, basically. And then essentially all of your columns you'll want to put inside that row and then have all your content kind of inside there, essentially. And the way this works is it uses what's called a grid layout. So it's basically a nice way of doing what we've been doing before, what we saw before with like inline blocks. So inline blocks, you can line things up next to each other and do all that stuff. Kind of sucks. So what this does is it gives you classes that let you do it for you. So the entire width of the screen is broken up into 12. So there's 12 different pieces. And then from those 12 different pieces, you can select how many pieces you want to use at a time for each thing. So one example here. So if you want to have 4 columns, you divide 12 by 4, you get 3. So then the class that you'd put on everything inside there would be call3. So if I want to do that, then what I would do here is I would do 4 divs with a dot call 3 like that. And now I have 4 divs that have a column 3. They'll now be in fourths as you look at the page, essentially. Same thing with if I want to split it in half, I would go call -6, and then I put 2 of them in there. Same sort of thing. You always want to make sure that's inside the row, and then you can do it from there, essentially. If you overflow, it'll break a line. So let's say, for example, you have a call 6 next to a call 7. That's 13, not 12. So what'll happen is the call 6 will be on one line, and then the call 7 will wrap around and go underneath it, essentially. So just keep that in mind when you're going on, when you're making these things. There's a bunch of resources about the grid if you're interested. But essentially, the easiest way to deal with this is you can just have a row and then put as many columns as you want in there. It'll just do the division for you, and you can run it that way. So if I'm looking at this, I have a row. Okay, I have these 4 things. Instead of trying to figure out how many columns I need, I just go like that. And now all of this will be evenly spaced inside the row. Now, what if I want to do a second row? Well, I can just copy this row, and I can do another row like that, and we're good to go. Because if I put more columns in there, now it'll divide by 5, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So every time you want to do a new row, you can just do it like that. Okay, So if we want to have this sort of information that we had on the left-hand side here, we have one long sort of sentence, we can instead do a row and we can have 3 columns. And we just do column and then we put the text inside of it, column, put the text inside, column, put the text inside. And we get a 3-column row. So super easy to do, just like that. We can also add some tags to make it look even better. So we can put in some heading tags, like let's say a heading 4 and then a paragraph. And now we get this kind of separation where we can say 1,000 students or more than 1,000 students have completed our workshops. Cool. And then we put a little bullet point underneath that, or 80% of participants, bullet point underneath that, that sort of stuff. This looks way better than having a bunch of paragraph tags like this, is the main point. So from here, you can try using grids. You can make up your own content, or you can just use some fake, like you can just mash on the keyword a bit. Basically, for the parasites, you can start adding in things like either information about product features or something like that, and you can just put that into your site. So the other designs that you have here, where you have met vein, we now have the stuff at the top like this, and then you can add in something like this at the bottom here where it says features. Or once in a chameleon, we have this heading and the nav bar at the top here, and then we have these 3 sections down below. If you're looking for examples, if you go on the example site, which I'll link again, because I think I forgot to link it last time when I put it in here. So I put that in the chat. If you go on the examples, I believe it's called features. Yeah, so features also has some examples of ways you can split the stuff up very nicely as well. So we'll give you guys a chance to try that out. I believe we're all back in now. Okay, so what if we actually want to make the text look a little bit nicer? So what we can actually do is we can add in some icons. This is also by the same team that make Bootstrap. In fact, actually, I think if you go to the Bootstrap website, if I remember correctly, I believe on here, they actually have, icons. So this is basically from their Bootstrap icons website. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom here, all the way past all the different icons, it actually tells you how to load everything in. So if I take a look at, there it is. So we can actually copy this link and then bring that across. That is available in the slides though. So if you do have the slides pulled up, you can just copy this and paste it into the top of your page, just at the underneath where it says Bootstrap CSS. So right under here, just in the head, you can copy and paste that in there. And what that'll do is that'll add in a whole bunch of icons that we can use for our site. So there's a bunch of other alternatives in here. If you want to look at those and you want to use those instead, be my guest. Doesn't really matter to me. As long as it works. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. Just be careful when you are picking out other icon libraries. Lots of them charge, and if you use them on projects where you're releasing the source code, for example, and letting other people see how your stuff works, you can be charged for that as well. So just be careful when you're picking out your libraries. So you can check out the reference site. Basically, the easiest way to use this is if I go ahead and click on this. Let's say, for example, that I wanted to use, I don't know, I want an arrow, right? So I want to have some sort of an arrow. I can go ahead and I can see, okay, this is the name for it down here. If I go ahead and click on it, you'll see, okay, this is what I need to add to my code. So this will basically work essentially like a piece of text. You can also, if you want, you can just copy this SVG. So if you don't want to bother installing the whole set of icons, you can also just literally grab this SVG and this will just work. So if I go ahead and copy this, for example, and then if I go back to my page that I was working on and I just paste that in the code here. So right down here, right after where it says Finding Lizards, put that in there, save it. And now if I refresh, it'll just load that little arrow right there for me. So you can use it either way, whichever way you want to use it, whichever is easiest for you is up to you. But they have the code for it here, and they also have the option to download it as an SVG or copy the HTML of the SVG, whichever one you want. And so yeah, icons, if you are using the I, are text. So that means you can make them larger and smaller based on your font size. So if you want to make things bigger, you can. The other thing as well with this is that it aligns with whatever your text alignment is. So one of the things that we didn't talk about with text is if I go ahead and I add in a style tag and I had some text that I wanted to style, let's say like a paragraph tag, what I can do is I can actually do text align. And what I can do here is I can change it to center or left or right. And what happens by default is it starts at left and then you can change it to something like center. And the difference that you can see is like this on here. Where on the left-hand side, everything's kind of shoved to the left and it starts at the left and it goes to the right. Whereas at the center, everything starts in the center and then works its way to the right from there. You can also add in text center as a class. So instead of having to add in your own style, you can basically just do this directly through a class. So all you do is on anywhere that you want your text to be centered, you just add in a class that says text-centered. So like I was saying last time, Bootstrap is a class-based CSS framework. So unlike Pico CSS that we looked at last time, this one uses classes for everything. So you tell it how to do all the stuff that you want it to do through classes. And so in this case, we tell it to do, hey, we want our text to be centered on these columns. So we go ahead and can add in text-centered, and then the text will be centered on there. So some examples of where you'd use icons is on the Schulke Knight site, we have them here, or on the University of Calgary, some pages will have this stuff here as well, where you can see it's off to the left, and then it starts from there. Basically just a way to add a little bit of flair so it's not just raw text everywhere. So what we're going to do is try and add some icons to that text that you added in last time. If you want to as well, you can also add in colors. I would recommend, honestly, because I'm kind of lazy, the way that I tend to do this, if I want to, there's ways you're supposed to do this, but if you want to add in color to text, I often just literally come in here and you can just do an inline style. You don't want to do this all the time, but for stuff like this, it's sometimes just easier to just say, hey, I want this to be colored like red or whatever it's, right? So I just say, hey, I want these three to be color red, and we're good to go. The multi-editing thing that you're seeing there, by the way, if you click on anything in VS Code, you can hold Alt or Option on a Mac, and you can click, and it'll make multiple cursors for you. And then you can start typing on multiple places at once if you want. So if you have the same stuff, you can copy paste it in multiple places. So yeah, basically go ahead, add in some icons, add in some color if you want. Here's kind of what it would look like on some other designs. So Metvane didn't even bother using any extra colors or anything like that. But then with the Chameleon one, we did for that one. So yeah, we'll give you guys a chance to try that out. Resume the recording. Okay. So we looked at kind of having these icons, changing around colors, messing around with that sort of stuff, but there's other ways we can make stuff stand out. So last time we talked about cards. And so cards are basically just essentially a way of doing this, but a little bit fancier. So if we really want to draw attention to some sort of information, maybe it's important, we can basically do that with cards. One good example of this is actually on the, if you look at Ignite site, if we actually come over here to Scorch, you can see here the sessions are actually a card. So you can see here, they kind of have one group of information for each session here. So this is a common way that you would use something like a card in order to sort of encapsulate one piece of information about like sort of like an event or something like that. People also do this for like blogs, for like articles, for example. Actually, again, on the Ignite site, we have this blog, we have these articles, and all the information about the articles kind of each in their own card. So cards come in tons of different shapes and sizes. Basically what they are is just like a grouping of stuff together that's kind of like visually designed to look like it's together. This, when you look at this with your eye kind of sees there's a border here, and it just thinks about the fact that like these things are related to each other. So there's tons of different examples you can see here in different ways, and tons of different formats. You can see here, this one is basically just like text with a little icon in the corner. These ones have images. These ones don't have any images, but they're laid out vertically. There's a whole bunch of different ways of doing cards. But at its core, it's really super simple. There is an outer card, which you would put inside of a column. So now that we have these sort of column layouts that we have, we would put our card there. We then have a card body, and then we can put in our title and our text inside there. So you can easily read it from here, but if you ever forget this stuff, like I said before, there's no point in memorizing it. You can just come to the documentation, come to components, and then down to card, and you can see exactly what this sort of stuff would look like right down here. So don't bother memorizing it. Always, you can just come back and check what this stuff looks like. And so they do work better in groups. So you can actually use these, for example, by using a snippet BS5 card grid, and this will actually just generate a bunch of the code for you. So if you do want to put them into a grid together, let's say you have your container and then you have a row, all you would do inside here is you just do BS5, and I think it's just grid. I think it's card. I forget if it's card grid or card groups. Hold on. Card grid works. So then we have a row, and then we have all of our columns with our cards inside of it. So that'll generate everything for us. We just need to make sure that we put a container around the outside of this, and we're good to go. Okay. And then with that, the last thing to talk about is, or well, it's not the last thing, but one of the last things to talk about is colors, sizes, etc. Same thing, they all use classes in Bootstrap, so you just add a certain class to get that to work. So if I go ahead and click on cards, for example, and then at the bottom here, we can see that there's a whole bunch of these different colors that are available. And these are all CSS variables. So we can see here, we're saying the text background is going to be colored primary in this case. And so primary is this blue color. And so you can see here, that makes the card blue. If we go down here, we see the text background is going to be secondary. Okay, if we scroll up, it's going to be secondary, which is this gray color. And then you just change whatever these are. And then in Bootstrap, if you were to go through and look at the variables, like if I go ahead and inspect the site, if I were to look at the CSS variables for this site, I scroll all the way down to where it says primary, just somewhere. So in the root, we can see here there should be primary somewhere. There, primary. So that's what the color is. So if I went ahead and I started changing this color, then we should see a change in there. Oh, they've actually hard coded it. Never mind. They're not using the variable. Usually it uses the variable. So usually it would show up and work properly, but they're hard coding it, so it doesn't work. Okay. And so what about mobile? So as we saw before, with cards, we have the ability to make them sort of shrink down if we want to. And the way this works is you basically say what size you want it to be, and then what size of column you want it to be after that. So let's say, for example, you want it to be 50-50 as it went to sort of a medium size. Then what you want to do is you want to do col and then dash MD and then -6. And what that says is you want it to be a column. You want it to be, when you go to medium, you want it to be 6. So in this case, where we say col small 12, what we're saying is that we want it to be 100% width when it gets to being a small screen, essentially, because 12 is 100% width, and we want it to show up at that small screen size. So if you only include one, it'll just go by whatever that default is. If you include multiple of these, then it'll obey them as it goes and changes sizes. So if we want it to be 50-50 when we get to medium, we would go col dash MD dash 6. And then let's say we wanted it to be 100% when it's small, then we do col dash SM dash 12. And then if we wanted it to be when it's large, we want it to take up a third of the space, we do col dash LG dash 4 in this case. So yeah, column and then size, and then sort of the amount of columns to take up. So in this example, we see here we have col small and then 12, col large 6. So what this is saying is that when it gets to being small, it will, sorry, when it gets to being large, it'll take up 6. So we can see this is what we click on the desktop here, where it's taking up 6 columns. And then when we get it on mobile, we can make it take up 12. That's what the small 12 here is for. There's some other alternatives to cards as well if you want to make things group. So there's the old zigzag, which is we've already kind of seen, where we go back and forth between where the images are, and we can make them kind of take up different spaces. And then that's kind of what the card equivalent of that would look like on the right-hand side there. So the last step is we're going to try and make our site mobile friendly. So go ahead and try to pick a layout. So column 1 is 4 columns until medium. And then once it hits medium, make them 6 columns. And then when it hits large, make them 12. So we'll give you guys a couple minutes to give that a shot. Okay. So yes, just as an example of this, I just kind of have a site here where at the bottom here we have just 3 columns, and then as we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller, they eventually collapse down to 2 columns, and then as we get smaller and smaller, they eventually collapse down to 1. And so the way that I've set that up is I just have down here, we can see we have column, and then we have, let me just minimize the rest of this stuff so it doesn't really matter. Column large 4, column medium 6, and then column small 12. So it starts out large and it takes up 4. And then as it gets smaller, you're getting larger with the columns. So it takes up more space as you get smaller. And that's basically the main thing that most people do for mobile designs, because it makes it easier for you to see when you're on mobile. Okay. So I'm just going back to here. We talked about accordions last time, but they are available in Bootstrap. So if you're interested, you can find them out there. And then if you want to have people be able to like contact you and stuff like that, oftentimes a footer is a good way to start. Some places do require you legally have a footer if you have a copyright or anything like that. So just keep that in mind if you're ever making sites for, I don't know, like your dad's company or something like that. So you might have to have a footer to have a copyright in there. So just keep that in mind when you're making sites as well. So where all this stuff comes from, if you actually look at it, the column stuff is basically just a fancier version of what we were looking at before, where as things get smaller, you just change the size of them. So it's basically using media queries under the hood. So, and if you are interested in Flexbox, which is what it uses to do all of that sort of shaping, all of that stuff is available here. But you don't have to worry about any of that stuff if you're just using Bootstrap. I wouldn't even bother looking at this because it's more complicated than it needs to be. For most of the rest of the course, we're just going to be using Bootstrap anyways. So I would just recommend just learning the Bootstrap stuff and just getting comfortable using Bootstrap and using the documentation and all of that sort of stuff, because that's the main thing that really matters here. And so with that, we now get to JavaScript, which is the kind of the fun part. So JavaScript is basically what runs. So when you're looking at a page, the way that a web page works is that the user types in whatever the URL is, they ask for a web page, and they get sent back some content, and the browser loads the page. But the question is, how do we actually run some code after the user gets the page? And so that's where JavaScript comes in. So it's basically a language that runs in the browser. So it actually runs inside your browser on every page. And that's what actually runs anything that you see kind of changing stuff around. So when you go into Google search and you start typing in a search bar and then some stuff pops up dynamically, that's all powered by JavaScript. And so it allows you to modify a page directly as opposed to other languages that you can use on what's called the backend, which we'll talk about later, which you can use to modify stuff before it gets sent to the user. But JavaScript is what's used primarily in the actual browser itself. So let's say, for example, you wanted to have a button where you can click and it adds 1 to the button every time you click. This would be done in JavaScript, for example. So how to use JavaScript? It basically has the same usage as CSS. So when you're looking at this, you can have a script instead of a style tag, and then you can put your JavaScript directly inside the script tag, or you can have a JS file or have it load from the browser and then use a link tag to be able to link it in there as well. So the basic syntax for JavaScript is that you don't have to do this, but most people tend to end their lines with a semicolon. The reason you do this is that it used to be required. It's now no longer required, but sometimes it's just good practice to get into. Curly braces instead of indentation are used. So if you're coming from Python, instead of using where you have the indentation level tells you like what you have access to, the curly braces will tell you what you have access to. So you can put your code wherever you want, all over the place, but whatever's inside the curly braces will only have access to what's inside the curly braces, essentially. So when we're looking at something like this, we have a variable we set up called greeting right here, and then we have a function called greet. And when we type in name here, you can see we have these squiggly braces, and these squiggly braces mean that name only exists inside the squiggly braces, and outside the squiggly braces, name doesn't exist, but greeting does exist outside the squiggly braces because we put it outside. So anything further inside more of those nested curly braces, you can have access to, but anything further outside, you don't. And so with this, this is basically kind of what some basic JavaScript would look like. So common data types you'll run into are the same as what you'd run into in Python, where we have sort of strings, we have integers, we have floats, we have array, and then we have a new type called JSON. So if you use a dictionary in Python, it's exactly the same. If you have never seen a dictionary in Python, basically what a dictionary in Python does, well, actually, I'll just show you what a JSON does. So in here, we have the curly braces, and then we have some what are called keys, and then next to them we have values. So one key corresponds to one value over here. And what we do is if we wanted to then go into JSON and we wanted to get the value for Kieran, or we want to get this Kieran value here, we would do JSON, and then with square brackets, we would do name. So if I went in here and I had something like JSON, and then I would put Kieran like that, and that would return, name, and that would return Kieran. So anything on the left of the colon will give you back whatever's on the right of the colon, essentially. So it's mapping one-to-one. And you can also convert integers to strings and back again by using parse int and parse float and then passing in the string from there. Types are a myth in JavaScript. This doesn't really matter for this course, but just keep this in mind if you do end up using JavaScript down the road. Everybody who tells you about JavaScript is lying to you. JavaScript doesn't have really types properly, so just be very careful when you're dealing with stuff. As you can see down here, whenever you type in this, it does give you banana, and there's a lot of weird reasons for that, and that's just keep that in mind. So loops, unlike Python, there are 3 different types of loops that you can deal with. So the for each loop is what you typically find with a Python. So you say for, and then you put this stuff in here. The easiest way to remember this is basically if I go ahead and I pop open a script tag here. Whoops. Script. If I go ahead and I start typing in for, you'll see here we get the option to basically click. Oh, sorry, that should be an option to click. Why are you not loading for me? Maybe it doesn't like it because I'm not in a JavaScript file. So maybe I'll open a JavaScript file instead. Yep. So if I open a JavaScript file and then I type in for example, I can do a for loop, a for each loop, or some of this other stuff. So if I go ahead and I say for loop, we get this long version. If I go ahead and I say for each, we can do it for each element in an array. Or if I do it for, and then I think it's for in is the one that we're looking at here. So we can say whatever the thing is in here, right? And so all this does is it works the exact same as Python. So this loop right here that we see here would be the same in Python as saying for key in object, like that. And then we can add some stuff in it. So this is the exact same as this in JavaScript, basically. This other one is a bit more complicated. This is a fancier C style of looping. This basically lets you start from 0 go up to whatever the array length is. So if you have some sort of an array like 1, 2, 3, 4 here, we can go up to whatever the size of that array is, and then we can add to the index as we go. So what that means is basically we're going to go through 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, right down here, essentially. And then a while loop is just the same as a while loop as you would normally see in Python sort of stuff. So essentially, this is 3 different ways of doing the exact same thing. If you need to, you can come back and check this out. It's a little bit different than Python, but it's pretty similar for most of the part. So some other basic syntax, you have if. So ifs and while loops and stuff like that, you do have to have the parentheses here. So in Python, you can leave these out. In JavaScript, you do have to. So if I want to say if, and then I have some sort of a condition. So if I say like if x is greater than 5, for example, I do have to put that in the brackets. And then whatever is inside here will only run if x is greater than 5. Here are all the different comparisons. The only one that's kind of weird that you probably haven't seen is a triple equals instead of a double equals. So if I were to say, for example, let's say we had our x and our x was equal to 5 as a string. If I said if x equals 5, what do you think it's going to print? Or do you think, let's say I want to print something out here, so I can use console.log, which is kind of like print in Python, and I can say x is 5. Do you think that x is going to print here? Or do you think this is going to print at all here? See if we got some guesses.
This is going to print x equal to 5.
It is going to print it, yeah. And the reason why is because 2 equal signs, it will try its best to find some sort of a way to convince itself that whatever the value is on the other side is correct. And so what that means is, in this case, because it's a string, it will automatically convert the 5 into an integer first and then compare them. If you don't want to do this and you want to make sure that it's 5 and it's an integer, what you can do is you add in an extra equal sign here. It's very annoying. It's very weird. It's just JavaScript things. So if you want to make sure that x is a 5, so in this case, this would not print in this case. So just keep that in mind. A lot of bugs come up because of this. It's a bit of a nightmare. The language was written in 2 days. You can't really blame them too much. And then functions work pretty similar to Python. So functions, you can just go ahead and instead of saying def, you say function, and then you put the function name. So I can say something like grease here. And then I can put in my parameters. So if I want to put in somebody's name, I can make them have their name there. And then inside here, I can return whatever I want. So if I want to return their name, then I can return their name. If I want to do something with their name inside here, I can do something with their name inside here and then return it afterwards. So it works pretty similar to Python. A lot of the stuff that you'll find is the programming languages are pretty similar, but they're just a little bit different sometimes. You can have also default arguments like you can in Python. So if you want to have something that's default, for example, like you want to have something like, I don't know, greeting here, be something default like hello, and you want to allow people to change it, and you want to return greeting plus name, you could do that, for example, in Python. It also helps if you spell greeting correctly. Yeah. So that's the super basics of JavaScript. Now the question is, how can you run it? You can run it in files and in all that stuff. But like I said before, JavaScript is also just in the browser. So we can also just run this stuff directly in the browser. So if I go ahead and I hit F12 to open up my DevTools, as we've seen before, if I go ahead and I head to the console, you can open up any page you want. If this stuff is getting distracting, you can just click the little X here and it'll clear all that. And I can just start doing JavaScript in here. So if I want to say console.log and I want to say hello, I can just say hello in here like that. And it'll go ahead and run it for me. So I get the hello back there. If I want to do something else, like if I want to define functions, so if I want to define that function greet, for example, which takes in a name, this was a bad website to pick because it's very loud. But if I say greet name, and then I wanted to return the person's name, return name like that, then I could. And then now if I went ahead and I said greet, and then Kieran, at the end, I'd get back out Kieran. So we can just type it directly in our browsers to test it out if we really want to. So what we're going to do here is using the console, create a variable that starts at 0 as a string, and then create a function that basically takes in that string and then goes up 1 until, and then console.log the value. So we'll give you guys a couple minutes to try that one out. So everybody should be back now. So this is a fancier way of doing it, but the thing that really matters is you take a number, something like value. Let me just quickly make that bigger. So if you take something like value here, value, and you set it equal to something like 0. And then from there, we can say, well, the value is less than 5. Oops, less than 5. We can go ahead and we can just say something like inside the squiggly braces, value plot value plus equals to 1. And then close it off. Go ahead and run that. Oops. Go ahead and run that, and it goes through and does it. And then we come back to value here. We'll see the value is now. Oh, did I spell value wrong? Yes, it did. Hold on. Value is equal to 0. Oh, nope, my keyboard died. That's unfortunate. Okay. That is correct. I just can't hit enter because my keyboard is dead. So you'll have to just take my word for it, but that should work basically. And then, yeah, you can console.log it as you're running through to print it out the same way that you would for Python, for example. So we're going to cover one last topic here before we end off the day. We're not going to do all the rest of the slides that are in here because there's a little bit too many, but we are going to go back over this stuff at the beginning of next session as well. So if you are a little bit confused, don't worry, we'll go back over it again at the end of the sort of next session as well. And we'll also give you some time to work on the end of session exercise for today. But this is the big thing. This is the thing that actually matters for JavaScript. This is the thing. This is the reason why we tolerate JavaScript. This is the only reason why. And it's what's called the document and window objects. So in JavaScript, there's essentially there's two different, so everything is basically objects. So the same way that you saw in Python, whenever you were working with different, the Pygame sort of stuff, there was lots of objects that you're probably creating and doing all of that sort of stuff. With JavaScript, there are two important objects that exist as part of JavaScript. They're made for you and you can interact with. That's the document object and the window object. So the window object lets you mess around with the actual browser itself. So it lets you get information about the browser. It lets you see what's going on with the browser, and it lets you see kind of the information about it. The document object will let you see all the different elements that you see on screen. So everything that you see on screen can be modified and manipulated through the document object, and everything that exists inside the window can be modified through sort of the window. So things like the URL at the top here, the different tabs, all that sort of stuff is all accessible through the window, and the document kind of holds all of your different tags that you have in HTML. So roughly speaking, this top bar you can see at the top here is going to be your window, and kind of like the border around the outside of this is going to be your window. And then the document is actually like this page that we're looking at in the center here. So you can do cool stuff with it. So like, for example, window.location will give you information about what page you're currently on. So if I go to Shoe Ignite, for example, and I go ahead, pop open this, and I come into the console, where did my console go? Why is it so small? Oh, there. Okay. Let me see if I keyboard charged enough yet. Yeah, it is. Nice. So if I go window.location, we can see here, whoa, there's a ton of stuff in here as we're looking at this. So if I go ahead and actually hit enter, we can actually see all the different stuff that's inside here. And then what I can do is any of these things that are on the left-hand side here, I can pick out the information. So href, which is kind of what we're used to seeing with our link tags, is going to be our link. So if I go window.location.href, then I can see here the link that I'm currently on. So now, interesting question for you. What do you think happens if I try and change this value? What if I say something like this? Like ignite.com. So I try and reset the value. What do you think is going to happen? What are some guesses?
It's going to override it.
Yep. And then what it'll do is it'll send me straight there. So if I change it to Shoe Ignite, and that would change the page to change the page on me. So most of what you see in JavaScript is just that simple. It's essentially taking these variables and just changing them around for the most part. For a lot of like very simple things, that's what you're going to run into. So if I reset the location.href, it'll take me to wherever I'm going. And so the window in this case is mostly going to be pertaining to your particular tab that you're currently in for the most part. You can also get the screen size. So you can get the inner and outer widths and heights of stuff. Generally speaking, I'm going to be entirely honest with you, the only one that matters is inner. You're not really ever going to use outer width. Outer width includes this top bar at the top here. I don't know if I'm dating myself, but if anybody ever had like a family computer and, you know, grandma installed 12 different toolbars at the top here, then the outer height would also include that number. So generally speaking, you're going to want to just use the inner width unless you're doing something like you're trying to create like an extension. Like if you're trying to create like a new version of ad block, for example, then you might want to change that. But generally speaking, you're only ever going to want to use inner height and inner width. But that'll tell you how big people's screens are. And that's exactly how, when you're in CSS, for example, and you say at media, and then you say max width equals whatever, this is what it uses. It just runs a little bit of essentially JavaScript to do that check. There's also other crazy stuff. There's like databases and a bunch of other stuff inside here. We don't care about these. These are way too complicated for us. And then, so that's the window object. That's kind of like what you can see everything sort of in the broad window. But then the other part is the document object. And this is where we can start messing around with actual elements on the page. So I'm going to show you a little bit of this today, but we're not going to get into it too much because we'll talk about it next time. But essentially, when people talk about the word DOM, this is what they're talking about. And so what this allows you to do is change stuff. And so in order to change stuff, we first have to find it. So these are the ways you can find it. You can find it by ID. You can find an element by class name, by actual name. So that would be like the tag name. And then you can find it by, why is this? Oh, sorry. That should be tag name, not name right there. So that should be tag name like that. And then that'll give you the information that you're looking for. So the big thing to keep in mind is that anything that has an S will return an array, and then you have to find individual elements inside of it. But this is why having IDs is super nice on a page, because you can just say get element by ID and it finds exactly the element you're looking for right away. So super handy to use IDs, and then you can use it to access this stuff. If we're looking at whatever stuff is kind of inside of an element, there's a ton of different variables you can get inside of an element. So let me actually just come in here. So this is my test page. What did I do? Did I break this page? Okay, I guess I did break this page. Let's come in here then instead. So let's say I'm looking at, that's very annoying because I need a simple page to work with. Hold on. Let me see what's going on here. Okay. But once you kind of find an element, what you can do is you can get information about it. So .tag name will give you the individual elements sort of information about it. So it'll tell you if it's an H1, if it's a paragraph, whatever it is. This one you can't change. If you try and override this, the browser will ignore you. You can't just change tag names however you want, but other things you can. So inner text will show you the text representation of everything that's inside of it. If you want to see the HTML that's inside of something like a div, for example, you can use .inner HTML. These two you can change, although inner text is not very useful. I wouldn't recommend changing that. I would recommend changing inner HTML. And that one you can put in whatever HTML you want, and that'll give you any information that you want. So you can see here we have an ID of title. So I'm document.get ID element ID by title, and then by ID, and then the ID is called title. And then from that, I've assigned that into this variable, and then I can mess around with it from here as I want. So when I ask for the inner HTML of this, it'll give me this inner HTML from here. If I change it, it'll change as well on the page. So we're not going to worry about this exercise. We're going to deal with this exercise next time because this was a lot of information that we covered in one day. So we're not going to, we'll talk about all this stuff again next time. We have been going at a pretty fast pace. So I just, again, if you do feel a little bit lost or anything like that, be sure to ask questions to your mentors. We have been covering a lot of stuff very quickly. So any questions you have, you can ask them. We're going to give you a couple of minutes at the end of this to go through and talk with them. But first, I'll just talk about what we're going to do next time. So next time, we're going to use other people's JavaScript, as well as just talking about how to use JavaScript in general to kind of create some different stuff that we can see here. It looks kind of cool. The exercise for this week is we have a band called King, and they're basically a rock band, definitely not related to Queen in any way, shape, or form. And so the 3 different levels are going to be creating a coming soon page for the band, creating a single page that talks about them and their work, and then level 3 will be a multi-page site. So if we go ahead and take a look at something like this might be a coming soon page. One tip is to look at the background property. If you want to do something like this, where it's in the background, you can look at the background property and try and figure that out. Level 2, again, single page talks about the band. So it's got some albums and all that sort of stuff. The information should all be included inside the folder. And level 3, it's going to load. Okay, it is not loading properly, but there is a multi-page site that has different aspects to it. This GIF, I believe in it to eventually load. So as that's going, what I'll say is that we're going to do one last breakout room. Be sure to ask your mentors any questions you have about JavaScript, about Bootstrap, anything else that you're running into. And if you do have more questions after the session, be sure to ask them in the Discord, and somebody will be able to help you from there. Really, I do highly recommend using these resources. A lot of stuff with web development is just playing around, breaking stuff, and then trying to fix it. So I would highly recommend doing all this stuff to kind of understand how it all works. And with that, it looks like our GIF is not going to load. So there should be example pictures, I think, in the end of session exercise for today. Let me quickly double check, make sure that's actually the case. Exercises, where is end of session exercise? Yeah, so here's kind of what the examples would look like. So this would be like the homepage might look something like this. And then you have like a contact us page and then like an about us page, something like that, right? But whatever you want to do for those designs is up to you. So we'll go into breakout rooms for the last, I guess, like 2 or 3 minutes, and then you guys can ask any questions that you have from there.